So today we'll be talking about this kind of a new theme on learning with less supervision. And to give an overview, there will be three components that is covered in this theme. The first one is weekly supervised learning. And second is data augmentation. How can we create more diverse data from the existing limited collection of data that we possess? And lastly, I'll be talking about self-supervised learning, which is a quite kind of hot topic these days. Okay, so let's dive in. First part is about weekly supervised learning. And so just to motivate a little bit, this is a figure you've probably seen already in the very first lecture that I give on your network architecture. And so you've already learned that more than your network architecture, such as residual net and dense net, can have hundreds of layers, right? And they can contain easily over 100 millions of parameters. And these networks can always go deeper. And so if you look at this trajectory of how model size and also GPU power, computation power has evolved and changed over the years, and this is a plot that I took from the paper back in 2017. So we've only looked at the time window between 2012 and 2016. So the general trend, as you can see here, is the computing power keeps increasing and the number of parameters in your model keeps increasing too. However, in contrast, if we look at this number of images, right, the largest training data set that we have used, it has surprisingly remained quite constant over the years, right? Why is that? What would happen if we have used our resources to increase data set size as well? So those are two kind of important questions to ask. And so in response to the first question, why this data set size has remained the same? Well, it's because scaling data set size is non-trivial, and the process of curating a hand-labeled data set can be extremely labor-intensive, right? So, for example, in order to annotate ImageNet, which contain more than 1 million images, it can take up to thousands of annotation hours. And so if you extrapolate this to be even bigger, something around the scale of billion images, and you can imagine that's going to take annotators millions of working hours in order to kind of curate this annotated data set. This is almost impossible to achieve. And so if we look at in terms of levels of supervisions for these image recognition models we've been developing, a lot of these models and methods have been kind of heavily relying on this we call fully supervised regime, which means it requires manual labeling of thousands of images per concept. For example, for cat, dog, and floor, each of those concepts you have to collect a substantial amount of kind of labeled images in order to teach the machine what they look like, right? And then so the machine can pick up on the semantic and commonality. And on the other end of this spectrum is the fully unsupervised setting. We simply have lots of images coming from the web, and there's no label or annotations at all. And so in the past, what researchers in they typically observe is there's a significant gap exists between the fully supervised versus unsupervised learning. So we'll actually touch about that in the third part, how this gap has been kind of closed in the very recent research. So, okay, The reality is actually closer to somewhere in the middle, which is usually referred to as weakly supervised learning. And for example, if you look at social media data, for example, on Flickr or Instagram, I'm not sure if you guys use Instagram, but usually those photos are posted with hashtags associated with the image. And so those hashtags might contain, some information and signal that can be leveraged to kind of supervise the deep learning models. So this is certainly good. The question is, why don't we just take those data with hashtags and then train a model? However, the challenge, the flip side, is these weakly data comes with a lot of noise. And so, for example, hashtags are often, used to reference non-visual concepts. For example, hashtag love for this picture of cat and dog, or hashtag Throwback Thursday that has nothing to do with the semantics of this image, right? So if you use those labels to supervise the model, you might not end up teaching it a useful thing. And in addition, there's also the form of missing label problem. For example, a user may not provide kind of a complete list of hashtags for everything that appear in the image, right? So the dog may be the missing label here in this case. And sometimes the user may just provide the wrong label, right? Annotating with the wrong species, for example. This can occur a lot too. And so this is one of the very first work, also done by one of my former colleagues at Facebook. I researched that attempt to actually see how much value is there, and if we can leverage those weakly supervised data at all to learn some useful and generalizable visual representation. And this paper at that time, this was published around 2015. So at that time, it was based on the Flickr 100 million data set. And so in 2017, researchers from Google and a team from Carnegie Mellon University basically take this similar thought, but explored on this Google proprietary data set called GFT, which comprised of 300 million images, which is also kind of noisy in some sense. And of course, these precursor studies are kind of showing by increasing the size of the data that the model end up learning more powerful representations. And so when I was working at Facebook, this is the question that we kind of set out to ask. If data is indeed rendering this power for helping the model learning strong representation, can we actually leverage billions of images with hashtags for pre-training? And so I actually spent quite non-trivial amount of time at my work at Facebook working on this fun project, and to dive a bit into the details. So the first question is, how do we actually select the hashtags to begin with? Because if you look at this entire database of Instagram, there are millions, hundreds of millions of hashtags being created by users. Human beings are very creative, and there are all sorts of combinations of words can be kind of curated and created. And so the very kind of first idea is, why don't we take the original kind of set of ImageNet labels? And there are some kind of words have synonyms, and we just kind of merge them into a collection of 1.5 thousand. So ImageNet has 1,000 labels, and plus some synonyms. And then with those 1.5 thousand hashtags, when we query this public Instagram images and collect this 1 billion data set. And secondly, we create a much larger kind of data set containing objects with more diverse visual concepts. So this is by utilizing all these nuns that appear in this WordNet hierarchy. And there are 17,000 of those kind of nuns that we took. And then similarly with those hashtags, we then query in the database and gathered about 3 billion Instagram images. And for the network architecture, we used ResNext, which is a kind of a improved version of ResNet. Also developed by actually, this is Signing was a friend of mine. We actually graduated, and we were born in the same city, which is pretty rare, right, in this community. And especially, I was born in a relatively, I think, on the northwestern part of China, which is, I don't get to see meet a lot of people from the similar area. So this is the plot that kind of shows us as we vary this number of groups, there's an important parameter C that controls the total model capacity. And then you can see as C varies from 4 all the way to 48. So 48 is the largest model that we've trained on, which contain up to almost 900 million parameters. And this on the right side is when we measure in terms of this multiplication and addition flops. And so this work kind of led to this deep learning training at an unprecedented scale at the level of billions. And this training is done at the magnitude of higher than the previous work that exists. And the largest model capacity that we trained on, as I just mentioned earlier, contain roughly 861 million parameters. And this is done on a very large, diverse collection of semantics, which contains 17,000 hashtags. And this, of course, we have to leverage. This is the great thing of working in industry is this distributed training infrastructure that we are allowed to kind of, build on top. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to actually achieve this work. And here's some results that I would like to share. So the first question is, how effective are those representations that are actually being learned? And so in order to evaluate the efficacy of the representation, one popular approach is to perform transfer learning. So what we did is to perform pre-training on Instagram dataset and freeze all the kind of convolutional layers and parameters, and then only fine-tune this last layer, the FC layer on ImageNet, and to see, how well it actually helps generalize to these other data sets. And so this gray bar shows when you actually train from scratch using the same kind of ImageNet data set. And this pink bar shows when we perform pre-training using Instagram 1 billion dataset, and this corresponds to the same kind of semantic labels, 1.5 thousand hashtags that corresponds to ImageNet labels. And as you can see here, there's a kind of a significant improvement in terms of top 1 accuracy. And then the second thing we can observe on this kind of 3 purple bars here is the effect of increasing this, the diversity of, or this number of pre-training labels. And so the takeaway here is usually as we expand, if we maintain the same pre-training size to be 1 billion, but increase this hashtag size to be, let's say, 8.5 thousand and 70,000, it doesn't actually work as optimal as if you select this targeted kind of task to perform transfer. But the trend kind of reversed. And if we now change this target task to be ImageNet 5K, so this contains a lot more kind of concepts than ImageNet 1K. And just to give you some background, there are in total 22. There exists ImageNet 22K, and so these are randomly sampled kind of 5K from ImageNet. And what we can see here is as you increase this complexity in terms of label space for your target task, it actually benefits from a pre-training accordingly with larger visual variety, which means now if we compare pre-training with 1.5 thousand and then 8.5 thousand and all the way to kind of 17,000, it gives kind of a steadily better performance. So it's desirable to have such a large, diverse collection of semantics for pre-training. And this is kind of an observation that we had for this CUB fine-grained bird classification dataset, which contains 200 kind of fine-grained species of birds, and on the right side is places 365. And so consistently being able to leverage this kind of large pre-training with more semantics tends to help significantly. And the second kind of study that we were curious here is because of the data set is kind of contain inherently so much noise. So you might be wondering, how does this noise actually impede or affect this the representation learning? And because of this exact characterization of the label noise is very difficult, right? So it's actually hard to quantify exactly how much noise is there in an Instagram database unless you actually go through this kind of human inspection or the similar annotation process. And so what we did is to inject additional label noise on this. I heard someone raise the question.
Yeah, Professor, I had a small doubt. As we increase the number of target classes, why does the top one accuracy decrease?
Oh, let's go back. You're talking about which data set?
Yeah, in all of these data sets, on the x-axis, it says that as the number of classes in the target task increases, the top one accuracy decreases for all of these data sets, right?
Oh, this is because, okay, so these are different data sets, right? So ImageNet 1K, because there are only 1,000 classes, this is an easier task compared to ImageNet 5,000 and ImageNet 9,000. Are you asking why there's this kind of decline here?
Yeah, my question was, yeah, and why is the top one tier accuracy decreasing?
Yeah, this is because ImageNet 9K is an intrinsically harder classification problem, just because now you have to classify things into 9,000 instead of 1,000, right? So the task itself is harder.
So is it like still best in class for these, or?
Sorry, you were cutting out.
Is the performance still best in class for ImageNet when we have 9,000 classes?
Yes. Yeah, so what you should look at this plot is looking at this relative. So this gray curve, right, always compare with this baseline, which is trained on this kind of pre-trained on ImageNet 9K. This means you don't perform any pre-training, just perform the regular training from scratch using this ImageNet 9K dataset. And the other colorful kind of pink and purple bars shows the effect of transfer learning. And the point here is to see that by leveraging kind of a strong initialization due to pre-training, you end up getting kind of better top one accuracy on this task.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Cool. Okay, so this is okay. I was talking about how we can evaluate, right, quantify the effect of label noise. So we add this additional noise by kind of randomly replace, let's say 10% or 25% or 50% of this hashtags, sampling from, just doing this random swapping. And so that some of these hashtags are actually kind of, you can view them as a random noise, in addition to the noise that it already has in the data set. And then kind of we perform similar procedure, as we did before, but now this time the pre-training is done on this kind of noisy version, even noisier version of the Instagram data set. So interestingly, if you look at these pink bars, so the gray bars are no label noise at all. And the pink bars are the ones trained with 10% of additional noise. And the model actually is quite resilient to this label noise, even though you add additional 10%, right, by randomly swapping hashtags. The transfer learning performance actually, doesn't suffer that significantly. There is 0.6% of dropping here on 1K. And here on 5K task, there's 1%. But of course, as you kind of add more and more label noise, ultimately at 50%, kind of the gap becomes more substantial. And we also evaluated the effect of model capacity, just to see, how this, how the top line accuracy changes as we increase the number of parameters. So interestingly, if you look at this bottom curve, this is when we train with the original ImageNet itself, right, without any pre-training. And as you can see here, as we increase this model capacity, this curve almost reaching a saturating point, which means the larger model capacity actually doesn't help with this kind of a classification task anymore. Whereas in contrast, using this Instagram pre-training, you see that the curve is actually still going up, which means the more model capacity that you can add into, the better representation that the model is actually picking up on. And partly is because the pre-training data is so huge, so it benefits naturally from a larger model capacity. Okay, so there's a very recent work actually done by folks from Google this year called bit transfer. So the idea is kind of very similar to what we did at Facebook, and we'll be having a deep dive on this paper actually next Tuesday. And so let's stay tuned for more details on that. And any questions before we move on to the second part, data augmentation? I just want to pause here and check in. Okay, so if no question, I'll proceed. Again, feel free to, interrupt me anytime. I hear somebody raised hand.
Yeah, I have a question. So about all the previous plots, the training happened on the Instagram pictures, and the testing was on ImageNet after retraining the last layer, right?
Yes, correct.
So what would be the results if we did not retrain the last layer, like train on Instagram and immediately test on ImageNet?
Oh, that one wouldn't give you the optimal performance because, okay, so that wouldn't work because when we're training on Instagram, this last FC layer is completely different. The weight parameter, it's a matrix, let's say, of size. If we were taking a feature vector, let's say of dimension D, it's a regression problem to, depending on how many hashtags we're having, right? In the case of 1.5, it's essentially regression to 1.5, K dimension. And in case of 17K pre-training, it's regressing to 17,000 kind of output space.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really kind of apply if you immediately take that to ImageNet. So you have to do this FC layer fine-tuning regardless.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question?
Yeah, I had a question on, like, did you try also the fine-tuning of convolutional layers with, say, a learning rate which is 10 times or 100 times smaller than the learning rate of fully connected network?
Okay, so let me make sure I get your question correct. What is the learning rate?
I mean, in
rate
general, when doing fine-tuning, we train the fully connected network, but we also fine-tune the initial layers generally with a learning rate which is 10 times smaller than that of the learning rate of fully connected network, so that
Yeah, so the general trend that you would expect is, and this is again, I think, in general true for a lot of transfer learning technique, is the more parameter that you're allowed to fine-tune, right? If you're allowed to fine-tune up to kind of including FC layer and then including some of the convolution layers, you can actually get better top one accuracy.
Okay, yeah, but in this case, the amount of data decreases for fine-tuning, so that could have some impact maybe.
Why the data points is decreasing for fine-tuning?
We are fine-tuning on ImageNet, but we are training initially on the Instagram dataset.
So there's always going to be, I think it really depends on, I think, the capacity that you're actually allocated for fine-tuning.
Okay.
You can imagine there's a curve, right? As you fine-tune the FC layer, you get some bump, and the more blocks or the convolutional blocks you're adding, it kind of reaching the performance is kind of steadily saturating.
I see. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so given we have, I think, 45 minutes left, let's move on to data augmentation, which is equally exciting. So this picture here kind of shows you an overview of how data augmentation works, and it has become this de facto technique used in nearly every state-of-art model in, for image classification and text classification and so on. And so it's really kind of a simple and effective technique for combating this data scarcity issue, especially when you're constrained by the number of labeled data in your training set. And so the idea here is, for example, if we take this cute little animal called quokka, and then transfer this into different variations of quokka in different angles, maybe different background color, and it gives the network kind of more diverse view of what quokka is actually like. And the kind of final goal is to kind of improve generalization for this class. And this is, like I said, typically the workflow of data augmentation is you load an image from your database with corresponding label, and you apply some transformation function. And we'll be using this term a lot in the rest of this section we call TF, in short for transformation function. And so the kind of key property of transformation function is to change the pixels, but preserving this semantics of your original image. In other words, you're not supposed to kind of change the labels. And for, let's say, to us as a human, we can still recognize as a cat despite the change of color. And like I said, the idea really is to train on this more diverse transformed data so that you can end up getting better generalization. And it's very widely used in these training frameworks. And some examples of transformation functions, including, for example, color jittering, horizontal flip, and random cropping. And I'm sure if you've trained, you know, a model in PyTorch or TensorFlow, these are the functions you probably have, you know, encountered. And so these are typically kind of considered as heuristic data augmentation, which, you know, there is a machine learning expert is kind of involved in this loop, try to, you know, come up with this composition of transformation functions like we just saw, right? It could be, you know, rotation followed by flipping or something like that. And if chosen carefully, those data augmentations tuned by human can, you know, improve the model performance significantly. However, the drawback is also kind of obvious because, you know, humans are not kind of guaranteed to produce the parameterization or the composition needed to reach state of art. And especially if you think about the sequence of transformations, it's like a kind of a search algorithm, right? You have to search, you have to determine what is the transformation to use and what is the corresponding parameterization for that transformation. So it's a sequence of, you know, decisions have to be made. And so this led to this question of how do we automatically learn the compositions and parameterizations of these TFs, or in other words, transformation functions. And instead of performing manual search, this automated data augmentation holds promise to search for more powerful kind of transformations. And the biggest difficulty, right, involved in automating data augmentation is how do you actually search over the space of transformation. So I'll first talk about the work on TANDA, which also came out from the my, you know, former lab at Stanford, done by Alex Ratner. And so here's how this kind of pipeline works. This pipeline essentially, you know, takes your original database and it tries to learn this generator. It's a parameterized model so that it can kind of, you know, produce a sequence of transformation functions. And for example, this may include rotate by, you know, 5 degree, shift by 2 pixels, right? So there is a function and associated kind of parameterization. And this pipeline really, you know, is comprised of 2 components. First, you want to learn the sequence generator, here highlighted in green, and so that you can learn some of this useful sequence for augmenting your data. And second, you kind of, during training time, you use this generator, right, to kind of apply augmentation and train your final model. That's how this whole pipeline actually works. And so the key question is, how do you actually train this generator so that it can produce the sequence of transformations that is actually helpful for your downstream training task? And so this paper uses this idea based on GANs. And so as highlighted in yellow, the idea is to train the generator, right, to produce as realistic images as possible. And the way to do it is to say, let's augment this data, apply this transformation, and then let the discriminator to kind of tell apart whether this is a kind of a generated or whether it's a real image versus augmented image. And so the goal is you don't end up producing some, you know, garbage image that is completely outside your training data manifold. You want to make sure your augmented data still remains on the manifold. And so this objective of the discriminator is to produce values close to 1 for the original training data and produce values close to 0 for augmented data. And so your generator then is responsible for, you know, producing as good transformations as possible so that you can fool the discriminator. So that's kind of the idea of the whole pipeline in short description. And Does it actually work? Well, short answer is yes. These plots here shows evaluated on, for example, CIFAR 10. The blue bar is heuristic augmentation, and the green bar is learned by TANDA. And it's actually improving the generalization by 2%. And so on the right side, you can actually see some of these examples generated by TANDA. And so using a similar framework, this auto-augment has demonstrated state-of-art performance. I think when it came out, currently it's no longer anymore, but at that time it was kind of a splash when the paper came out. And in fact, now that you know how TANDA works, you can actually better discern, how this framework is in spirit very similar to what TANDA designed to be, right? So in TANDA, you have this discriminator, right, that is trying to directly, or actually in TANDA, you try to have this discriminator that tries to learn whether the augmented data is real versus not. And the change in auto-augment is to replace this discriminator with, let's say, with this kind of, you're directly optimizing for this validation accuracy on your end model. So you're no longer training a discriminator to optimize for the realisticness of your data. You're kind of being more deliberate and directly optimizing for what you're hoping to achieve, which is the high accuracy on your task data, right? So this is very straightforward to understand, but it also imposes some challenges during training time, because as you can imagine, right, every time that in order to update the gradient for this controller, you have to train this, train on your end model, right, to get this validation accuracy so that you can backprop your reward function to this controller. So auto-augment is extremely computationally expensive to train. So it's, the performance is quite impressive at that time. And then the same authors from Google Brain, not long after realized, you can actually do much better than that. You don't need to kind of exhaust all your computations to do this policy kind of gradient search. This RandAugment paper essentially found simple random sampling over this entire transformation function space with grid search can already outperform RandAugment. And so here's basically this idea, right? They replaced this learned TF sequences. Remember, we have this controller highlighted in green. Now that's completely gone. And so they replaced that part by applying each transformation function with this parameter-free procedure, which is uniformly sampling randomly, right, from your existing collection of transformation functions. And in their implementation, if you're curious, you can actually see there are about 14 different functions. You just randomly pick one. And so this reduced the search space very significantly, right? You don't have to search over transformation function multiplies with the associated parameters. And it turns out with this kind of simple grid search over the parameters of the transformation, you can already outperform auto-augment, and with a lot of computational saving. And I think this is another follow-up that came out last year called Adversarial auto-augment. And so this idea is kind of, now that you've seen, how TANDA works, auto-augment and RandAugment, it's all kind of designed with very similar kind of module and spirit. So the change that's being done here is there there is this adversarial component. Okay, so in their framework, they're trying to jointly optimize this end model performance. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse hovering over, maybe not. So this yellow box here, right, that's trying to minimize the training loss on your target task, let's say SimCLR10. And then simultaneously, you're training this adversarial controller so that you can generate this adversarial sequence of augmentations to kind of do something horrible to your final end model. So what this really is trying to facilitate is the end model is trained to be lost against those hard examples, and it therefore improves the generalization. So that's kind of the idea behind this approach at a very high level. And compared to auto-augment, this leads to about 12 times reduction in computing cost and 11 times shortening in time overhead. What is this? Okay, so times in time overhead. Okay, so the 12 times reduction in computing cost. And the top one error is reduced by 1.36 on SimCLR10, which was the new SOTA back then. And lastly, I just want to briefly also talk about, this is the work by my former lab mate, Sen Wu from Stanford, and it came out freshly at ICML this year. And it's an uncertainty-based sampling augmentation. So the idea here is, I think, very easy to understand. So previously in random augmentation, right, you kind of, you pick each augmentation function randomly, and you kind of curate a augmented data set and train on those, and that works pretty effectively. Now they kind of build one step on top. They say it's very important to actually pick among those augmented data points with the kind of most informative examples that lead to relatively high loss. And then if you kind of train on those uncertainty-based sampled examples, you end up getting kind of better performance than the vanilla random augment. And so, for example, they show the improvement over various data sets and model architectures, and it outperforms RandAugment by 0.59 on SimCLR10 and 1.24 on SimCLR100, which is quite significant, and also 1.54 on ImageNet. That's the number I have here. Okay, so I believe I haven't been able to kind of tracking the latest work in the past, I think 2 or 3 months, but I believe this is the current kind of state of art results. So that's the kind of material that I prepared for the data augmentation. And if you're interested in reading more on this front, earlier this year, I actually compiled a blog post series about this different texts and including theory and new directions on data augmentation. And I highly encourage that you take a read if you're interested in, especially if your project is relevant to this topic. Any questions so far? Okay, so the last part that we'll be diving into today is self-supervised learning. And self-supervised learning allows us to exploit a variety of labels that comes with the data for free. Right? So the motivation is quite straightforward. because producing these data set with well-annotated labels are very expensive. And unlabeled data is being generated all the time, right, on the web. Users keep uploading kind of photos and videos or text to the website. And so to make use of this large amount of unlabeled data, one way is to kind of design your learning algorithm or objectives properly so that you can actually get the supervision signal from the data itself without outsourcing to this annotation from labelers. And so I would like to kind of quote on a very famous picture from Jan Klein. You've probably seen this already in a lot of his talk, where he has this very interesting analogy, right? So if you look at self-supervised learning, that's like the sponge of this cake, whereas supervised learning is, the icing on top, and reinforcement learning is really kind of the cherry on top of this cake. So which means self-supervised learning plays a substantial kind of role in this kind of in the whole kind of machine learning literature. And so that's kind of what self-supervised learning is trying to achieve, is how can we get the labels for free from unlabeled data so that we can train on these unsupervised data in a quote unquote supervised manner. And often this is done through a pretext task, and which applies the transformation to the image, and then you can require this this learner to predict certain properties of your transformation from this data. And so here's again another kind of slides from this talk. You can think of all kinds of ways of constructing pretext tasks. For example, predicting future from the past, predict past from the present. These applies to some of the kind of time series data. But in the context of, let's say, image recognition, you can try to design a task. For example, predict this occluded region from the visible. And again, this is kind of different recipes where you can design this pretext task. And so let's start with this simple one, which is rotation. And so the idea here is we take an input image, which is a bird here, and we rotate this by a different kind of degree, right, like this. For every rotated image, there is a corresponding label associated with this image. And so, for example, 0 for 0 degree, and 1 for 90 degree, and y equals to 2 for 180, and so on. And so you wanted to train this kind of convolutional neural network so that it can basically predict this degree, right, depending on the label of this. So there are 4 different options. It's a regression to kind of 4 class problem. And as you can see, right, it's actually doesn't rely on any kind of human annotation, because you can construct this by rotating it in arbitrary degree. And another popular kind of pre-task is this idea of patches. And so what this paper has demonstrated is if you take any input image and divide it into, let's say, a 3 by 3 grid, and so you have 9 different patches. And so now you want to design this learning task so that the model can actually learn about this relative positioning of different patches. And so, for example, if you take this cat's eyes and noses, and then provide it with this patch of a year, right? Ideally, you want the model to kind of figure out this actually is with respect to this left side, right? So this cat ear should appear on the left side, upper left side. And you can construct this basically for free on all your images in this data set. And another idea, right, is colorization. Again, it's a similar idea of trying to take a black and white image and then to predict this kind of corresponding RGB pixels for those for each of those pixels. So I won't go into detail here. Given we have about, I think I want to wrap up around 5 and take some questions. So the most important two works I want to mention today, one is this Pretext Invariant representation learning, and after this I'll talk about SimCLR as well. So these two work are kind of highly related to each other, one built on top of the other. And so if you look at this previous pretext tasks that we look at, for example, rotation and patches, or predicting this colorization, right? All this pre-tasks involves predicting certain property of these transformation. And so it actually encourages the model to learn something that is covariant to this transformation. In other words, what do I mean by covariant? It tries to kind of encourage the model or representation to learn something and contain information about the transformation. And these information sometimes may not be directly kind of semantically relevant. Okay? So predicting how much a degree a cat is rotated, may not be necessarily kind of equivalent to this semantic. So what this author here proposes is really what you want this representation to be is invariant, right, under these transformations. So you should be able to predict this as a cat, regardless of your kind of how much degree that you rotated. You don't have to predict this exact degree to learn that. And so instead of predicting these properties on the left side, this loss function basically is a generalized form for some of these covariance kind of pretext, meaning you're trying to take an input image, right, and then transform this into I of IT, and then if you pass this IT through your ConvNet, and then you try to predict certain property of this transformation. So this is called covariant kind of learning. And on the right side, highlighted in this yellow box here, is what the authors propose called pretext invariant representation learning. So the idea here is to you have original image, right? You pass through your network and get some representation. And similarly, you can do this for a transformed version of your image. And the idea here is to, ensure that these two representations are very close in this transformed space. And so this loss function basically is what is trying to capture this similarity. So it achieves this by minimizing this notion of contrastive loss, which has been in machine learning literature for a long time, right? So this work basically tries to, so if you look at this workflow, I think it's pretty straightforward, right? You take an original input on top, and then get the embedding, right, for using this function f of vi. This is the embedding. And then similarly, you took this transformed image and go through the same network and get the embedding. And the idea is to kind of measure this similarity in the embedding space between VI and VI transform IT. And this S function is, you can think of as a cosine similarity, right, in this embedding space. So it's closer to 1 if these two pairs are very similar. And on this denominator, we're also kind of calculating this distance for the negative pairs. And these negative pairs ideally, right, should be as far as possible. And so you end up getting distance almost like 0. And so that's kind of the whole idea of using contrastive learning based method to enforce this notion of invariance. And so now you have this context in mind. What SimCLR, so when this paper came out right earlier this year, it was really a splash. Now, I think within almost half a year, the paper already has almost 400 citations, which means it's actually causing quite a big impact. And so if you look at this idea, it's actually very similar to what this PIRL is trying to achieve, right? You take this original input image and then augment this or apply 2 different transformations. You get 2 different views, xi and xj tilde. And then you kind of get this pass this through your neural network and get the hidden representation of both view of this data. And you can think of this f function as your as a resonant, for example. And then this is the component that is slightly new that is introduced in this paper. So the author actually found it's more effective if you actually take this representation and apply another kind of transformation like a multi-layer perceptron to kind of embed this representation further. And then finally, you'll calculate the similarity in this Z space. Again, it's the loss term is very similar, right? You're trying to quantify this cosine similarity between these 2 vectors to make sure they're as close as possible. And at the same time, for this negative pairs, you want them to be far away possible. And so this is exactly what the contrastive learning is trying to achieve. And the authors also found that actually data augmentation or composition of multiple data augmentation is crucial for the success of their technique. And one of the kind of main observation is that unsupervised learning benefits stronger from this data augmentation than this supervised learning task, which I found quite fascinating. So that's the second, key kind of insight from this paper. If you kind of relate the SimCLR versus what we just saw in PIRL, okay, so there are kind of really the new piece here is the use of composition of data augmentation and also this transformation of the hidden representation space. The third new component is also the use of temperature scaling, which the authors claim in the novelty part, right? This divided by this temperature in the loss function is also helping with the performance. And so this is the in terms of top 1 accuracy on I believe this is measured on ImageNet. And you can see, right, this is the green dots are using supervised learning, which is kind of using human annotation. And these red dots are, using SimCLR. It's actually quite encouraging to see how it's actually, getting really close to this supervised cart. So to summarize what we talked about today, it's really a lot of stuff to digest, I'm sure. So quickly summarize and recap. We first talk about weakly supervised learning. And this is when you can leverage a data set that containing, for example, noisy labels, but at the same time saves your effort to kind of go through each of those and annotate them. And so this web data makes it widely applicable for weakly supervised learning, such as Flickr, and this GFT is proprietary, so it's really not applicable to this broad research community here. And then we also talk about leveraging Instagram 3 billion for pre-training. And in the next paper presentation, we'll be seeing this bit transfer. And second part, we talk about data augmentation, which is a widely used technique for improving generalization of your deep learning models. And there is kind of the trend of using automated data augmentation to replace this human-designed heuristics. And a lot of this kind of interesting approaches, including random augments or adversarial auto-augment, has been popping up lately, which is quite interesting to see. And lastly, we've talked about self-supervised learning. And a lot of these learning tasks involved the design of pretext tasks. Is how you construct these learning tasks from the data itself without human supervision, such as rotation, matches, and so on. And then we've also contrasted this difference between invariant learning versus covariant learning. So for example, rotation prediction is a type of covariant based pretext task. And invariant learning, this task including contrastive learning-based framework, such as SimCLR, and which recently has achieved state-of-the-art performance, which is very, very encouraging to see. Okay, so that's all I have for today, and we have a couple minutes left. I'd be happy to take questions, and let me actually close this slides. And